Welcome to Retro Reads, where timeless mysteries come to life. Today, a new case awaits, full of twists, secrets, and thrilling revelations. Settle in, relax, and let the adventure begin. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from, and at what time. Let's get started and dive into this unforgettable story. It was precisely 8:22 on a sunny spring morning, and Nero Wolfe, ensconced in his customary oversized chair, looked upon the breakfast tray Fritz had just deposited on the polished mahogany table with an expression of distinct irritation. The omelette was perfect, golden as always, the toast precisely browned, the coffee robust and fragrant. Everything, in fact, appeared exactly as Wolfe expected, save one glaring omission. "Where?" Wolfe said, his voice dangerously mild. "Is my sausage, Fritz?" Standing by the doorway, Fritz Brenner twisted his apron nervously in his hands. He cleared his throat twice, avoiding Wolfe's penetrating gaze. "I regret, sir, there will be no sausage this morning." "No sausage?" Wolfe's tone sharpened slightly, as if the notion offended not merely his palate, but the proper order of the universe itself. "That sausage is the only edible thing that charlatan Kesler produces worth consideration. Have you severed relations?" Fritz hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, glancing toward me as though seeking moral support. I shrugged sympathetically. Intervening between Wolfe and breakfast was always hazardous territory. "No, sir, not exactly," Fritz stammered finally. "There has been difficulty." Wolfe's eyebrows contracted infinitesimally, a minute but ominous shift. "Difficulty?" Fritz nodded somberly. "Yes, sir. A rather delicate matter. It concerns your safety." Wolfe's expression darkened further. "Phooey," he grumbled, pushing away his breakfast untouched. "Archie, it appears we have trouble in the kitchen." "Sit down, Fritz," Wolfe instructed gently, a concession that told me plainly how deeply Fritz's anxiety disturbed him. Fritz obeyed, sinking onto a nearby chair with a sigh of relief. "I received a note, Mr. Wolfe," Fritz began, voice subdued. "Anonymous, unsigned. It said something about your sausage being deliberately tainted. I thought perhaps a joke at first, but then—" "Then?" Wolfe prodded. "Then I telephoned Mr. Kesler's shop yesterday afternoon." Elsa answered, frantic, saying her father had suddenly collapsed. They took him to the hospital. He was not well at all. Wolfe frowned thoughtfully. "And the sausage?" "A special order arrived early this morning," Fritz admitted unhappily. "I could not risk serving it. The timing was too troubling. Someone might be targeting you." "Nonsense," Wolfe muttered sharply, but I noticed the slight tightening of his lips, an involuntary admission of concern. "Where is the shipment now?" "In the kitchen," Fritz replied. "Sealed." Wolfe scowled, shifting his heavy bulk in the chair. "Archie, you will call on Elsa Kesler today and clarify matters. Fritz, bring me that infernal note." Fritz stood hastily, visibly relieved that Wolfe had taken charge. "Right away, sir." As Fritz departed, Wolfe's eyes met mine, their expression inscrutable. "What?" he asked pointedly. "Do you make of this absurdity, Archie?" "I think," I replied mildly, "that your enemies must be getting desperate indeed if they've started to threaten your breakfast." Wolfe merely harumphed, irritation masking what I knew was genuine unease. 10 minutes later, Fritz returned, handing Wolfe a neatly folded sheet of plain white paper. Wolfe studied it carefully beneath narrowed eyelids, his face gradually darkening with displeasure. "A bit of secret ground into your sausage," Wolfe quoted scornfully. Absurdly melodramatic, clearly someone familiar with Fritz's temperament. Fritz shifted uneasily. "Should we call Inspector Kramer?" "No," Wolfe snapped emphatically, placing the note firmly on the tray. "Police involvement would only invite absurd complications. This matter requires subtlety." Fritz nodded solemnly. "I leave it entirely in your hands, sir." Wolfe sighed, shaking his head slowly. "Your distress, Fritz, is profoundly irritating. You are never rattled without reason, and I dislike mysteries involving my domestic arrangements." Fritz offered a weak smile, visibly comforted by Wolfe's indirect reassurance. Wolfe turned to me with a curt nod. Archie, Elsa Kesler will undoubtedly be reticent. Exercise charm if necessary, but secure the truth promptly. My appetite cannot bear further disruption. Right away, I agreed, though charm might be stretching my abilities with Elsa Kesler. Wolfe leaned back with a faint grunt, closing his eyes as if to dismiss the subject entirely, but I saw how firmly his fingers gripped the chair arms, betraying a deeper, unspoken unease. I grabbed my coat from the hallway rack and glanced once more at Wolfe. Any particular suspicions? None, he murmured, eyes still shut. Merely curiosity, but understand clearly, Archie, I despise threats to my peace of mind almost as much as threats to my life. Elsa Kesler received me at the charcuterie's counter, her dark eyes wary and defensive. I'd met Elsa before, reserved, meticulous, and never particularly forthcoming. Today, however, her reserve had deepened considerably, her expression guarded as I inquired about her father's sudden illness. My father collapsed yesterday afternoon, she confirmed tersely. He was supervising a tasting. Everything seemed fine at first, but he suddenly became faint and confused. Anything unusual beforehand? No, she answered flatly. Nothing. I see, I said casually, leaning against the polished oak counter. Fritz received a special order from you early this morning. Did anyone else handle it? Her eyes flashed defensively. Of course not. I packed it personally. There was nothing wrong with the order. Yet Fritz received a warning that something unpleasant had been ground into it, I observed mildly. Doesn't that seem odd to you? She hesitated for a fleeting instant, betraying something akin to fear, then caught herself. Ridiculous, she replied sharply. This whole affair is absurd. My father is ill. Surely that's enough. Maybe, I conceded amiably, turning toward the door. I hope Gustav recovers quickly. He's under close observation, Elsa replied softly. The doctors say poison. I paused, turning slowly. Poison? Elsa met my gaze with silent dread. Yes, some form of contamination, they think. My smile was gone now. Interesting timing, I noted quietly. Considering Fritz's warning. Yes, Elsa whispered, barely audible. Interesting indeed. Leaving her standing frozen behind the counter, I hurried toward Wolfe's, suddenly anxious to deliver news I knew he would like even less than missing sausage. The next morning found me back on the Lower East Side, standing inside a charcuterie that smelled, depending on your sensibilities, either like heaven or the back room of a German meatpacking guild. Kesler and Son was neatly kept, though the tidy display cases had an air of quiet neglect about them, like a hostess who dressed for guests who never arrived. Elsa Kesler stood behind the counter in a pressed white apron, her dark hair pinned with the same precision she applied to slicing mortadella. She had the look of someone who'd mastered the art of grieving without letting it wrinkle her blouse. When she saw me, her mouth tightened slightly. Mr. Goodwin? She said, tonelessly. I assume this is not a courtesy call. You assume correctly, I told her. Though if I were a different sort of man, I'd make one just to try your smoked venison. But let's start with your father. How is he? Stable, she said. He regained consciousness briefly late last night. The doctors still don't know what caused it. They're running tests. Did he say anything useful? She hesitated. He was confused, spoke in half sentences, in German mostly. About sausages? She gave a mirthless smile. About sins, that's all I'll say. I nodded as if that sort of abstract diagnosis was common in the meat trade. And the special order, the one delivered to Fritz? I filled it myself, she said. No substitutions. It was prepared according to your chef's specifications. I verified the packaging personally. Then perhaps someone tampered with it after you sealed it. She looked at me flatly. If so, they had to pass 3 locks and 2 employees to do it. I glanced toward the back room. That brings us to the staff. Everyone accounted for? Her jaw tensed. Almost. Jasper didn't show up yesterday. No call. No note. That unusual? Extremely. She met my eyes steadily, as if daring me to draw conclusions. I did what I usually do in those situations. I drew them anyway, but kept them to myself. At least for now. I took a slow lap around the shop, nodding amiably to the employees still present. A pale, pimpled boy in his 20s sliced salami with mechanical indifference. A woman at the register, older and hard-eyed, offered me a brittle smile that never reached her gaze. The silence in the air wasn't just professional. It was defensive. That particular kind of hush you get when everyone knows something, but no one wants to say it aloud. "Jasper Mun," I said, to the young man as he stacked pancetta. "He disappear often?" He looked up, eyes darting to Elsa's closed office door. "Nah," he said. "He was weird, but steady." "Weird how?" He shrugged. "Kept notes, wouldn't let anyone touch his ledger, talked to himself a lot, but always on time." "Ledger?" The boy flushed and returned to slicing. "Nothing. Just forget it." I didn't press. People under pressure close like clams if you shove too hard. Back in the main room, I leaned against the counter where Elsa was rearranging a tray of mortadella with surgical precision. "You'll tell me if your father remembers anything else?" I asked casually. "If there's something worth telling," she said. "Yes." "And if the police get involved?" Her lips curved into something that might have been a smile in poor lighting. "They'll find nothing here. Except meat." I tipped my hat. "Let's hope it stays that way." Outside, I jotted one note. Jasper Mun doesn't run without a reason. And Kesler's staff was hiding something, probably in plain sight. I swung by Carlo Demaglio's gourmet shop on my way back because in this business, when everyone's avoiding you, the man who's too friendly is usually the one to watch. Carlo was slicker than a buttered eel. Dressed in a tailored double-breasted jacket, he shook my hand like we were old pals who'd once rescued each other from financial ruin. "Archie Goodwin," he beamed. "A pleasure, always. How's the great wolf?" "Hungry," I said. "His usual supplier's out of commission." "Ah, Gustav," Carlo said with a theatrical frown. "Tragic. Brilliant man. I'd offer to help Fritz myself, but your boss is, shall we say, particular." "He is," I agreed. "I'm making inquiries? Routine?" Carlo spread his hands. "Ask away. I have nothing to hide. Gustav and I were competitors, yes, but I respected him. Still, when old men start falling ill suddenly, one wonders." "One does," I said. "You hear anything about the missing staffer, Jasper Mun?" Carlo's eyes gleamed. "Ah, Jasper. Nervous type, always scribbling. I heard he vanished. Probably couldn't handle the pressure." "What pressure?" He chuckled. "Please, Archie. Gustav ran a tight ship. Jasper was from a different generation. He thought there were secrets in sausage. Romantic nonsense." I filed that away. "No secrets in sausage?" Carlo leaned closer. "Only flavor, my friend." He was too polished, too eager, and just vague enough to pique my instincts. I left with a complimentary smoked duck and a mental note. Carlo knew more than he was saying, and far more than he should have. And somewhere, Jasper Mun was either hiding or buried. Either way, he was the next link in the chain. After excusing myself from the front of the shop and dodging Elsa's icy stare, I made my way toward the back office. She hadn't explicitly granted me access, but I've always found that permission is often best asked after the fact, particularly when time is short and Wolfe is waiting. The room was spare but meticulously ordered, rows of shelves lined with ledgers, recipe books, and a wall calendar that still read last month. The desk drawers were locked, but the cupboard near the far corner was ajar, and curiosity, being one of my more active vices, led me straight to it. Inside, behind a battered 3-ring binder labelled Spice Ordering Index 1987, was a slim manila folder. Tucked neatly inside was a single sheet of white paper, neatly folded once. I unfolded it and stared. The letter was typed, no signature, no letterhead, no visible fingerprints. Its language, however, was far from ordinary. The sins of the past cannot be salted away. You who seasoned betrayal will find it ground back into your meat. The balance must be restored. Cryptic, yes. Ridiculous? Possibly. But after years in Wolfe's service, I developed a trained eye for threats disguised as theatrics. The phrase, ground back into your meat, was just a shade too clever to dismiss outright. It read like something written by a person who understood both metaphor and mortadella. I slipped the letter into my breast pocket, replaced the binder, and quietly shut the cabinet. Whoever wrote that note wasn't just threatening Kesler's life. They were alluding to something buried deep, something old, and judging by the phrasing, it wasn't a personal grudge, it was a reckoning. On my way out, Elsa gave me a look that suggested she suspected I had found something, though she said nothing. I smiled with deliberate innocence, promised to check in again soon, and stepped back onto the sidewalk, the letter prickling against my chest. I had just enough time before lunch to make it back to the brownstone. Wolfe would want to see it immediately, and I was curious to see what, if anything, it might unlock behind that overfed forehead of his. Wolfe read the letter twice, once for content, once for cadence. He didn't speak during either pass, which told me the wheels were turning fast. When he finally did look up, his gaze was fixed somewhere near the ceiling, as if the plaster might echo a memory. "The phrasing," he said finally, "is not merely florid, it is mannered." "That's one word for it," I replied, handing him a glass of beer Fritz had left on the side table. "The rest of us call it creepy." He ignored me, tapping the folded sheet with one finger. "You see this? Seasoned betrayal. That's not just melodrama. That's culinary language, tempered, selected. Whoever wrote this wasn't trying to threaten Gustav in general terms. They were referencing something precise, something real. Like a recipe? More like a ritual, Wolfe murmured. "You recall Fritz trained under Kesler in Würzburg shortly after the war?" "Sure," I said, and never stops reminding me of it when I overcook a chop. Well, Würzburg was home to one of the more esoteric branches of German culinary restoration. There were rumors, never proven, of recipes used to encode information during the war, ingredient ratios standing in for numbers, instructions as cipher keys. I blinked. "You're saying Gustav might have been part of some kind of sausage-based spy ring?" He didn't dignify that with a reply. This letter's language echoes a style used in a particular cookbook, Küchengeheimnisse, published in 1943. I have a copy. Fetch it. I crossed to the shelf and pulled the dusty volume free. Wolfe took it without another word and began flipping pages slowly, searching not for flavor but for ghosts. It was close to 6 when I placed a call to the Kesler shop, and a harried voice told me Elsa had stepped out. That worked in my favor. I'd taken the liberty of requesting a few background details on the missing man, Jasper Mun, and finally the trickle of information had given me something solid. He'd rented a small studio apartment above a shuttered piano repair shop in Fort Greene, paid in cash, came and went irregularly. One neighbor described him as quiet, too quiet, which I've learned usually means kept to himself but gave me the willies. When I got there, the landlady, a stooped woman with a cough like a wood chipper, reluctantly let me in, provided I agreed to say I was his cousin. The apartment smelled of old newspapers and coffee grounds. The bed was made, the dishes clean, but the place had been vacated in haste. On the writing desk sat a thin ledger, its corners dog-eared and its contents, if any, carefully removed. I found nothing else except a torn envelope addressed to Jasper M. in Kesler's distinctive block lettering. No note inside, just the flap, where the glue had been unevenly applied, as though by a shaking hand. Back in the hallway, the landlady confirmed he hadn't been seen since the morning Gustav collapsed. I thanked her with a tip and stepped into the evening chill, wondering whether Jasper Mun had gone into hiding or been hidden by someone else. Either way, Wolfe wasn't going to like it. And when Wolfe doesn't like something, the world tends to feel it. It was shortly after breakfast the next morning, a breakfast notably absent of any meat products when Fritz appeared at the office door. He was holding his apron in both hands like a flag of surrender, which by Fritz's standards was tantamount to declaring emotional collapse. Wolfe, who had just returned from his orchid session and was lowering himself into the big chair with that particular blend of effort and dignity, looked up at him sharply. "Yes?" Fritz didn't speak right away. He stood there, oddly stiff, as though he were holding in not just words but years. "I would not bother you with personal reminiscences," he began, "but this is not merely personal." Wolfe's brows rose a millimetre. "Indeed." "I trained under Gustav," Fritz said, stepping farther into the room. "Not only in the culinary sense, after the war. Würzburg. He was different then, ambitious, exacting. But he had secrets. We all did, I suppose. Some from necessity, some from fear. But his were organized." Wolfe steepled his fingers and watched him intently. Fritz continued. "There were rumors," he said, "that Gustav and a few others had found a way to send information past Allied sensors, using recipes, ratios and measurements, phrases that only certain men would understand. I dismissed it then. We were hungry. Everything felt like code." "And now?" Wolfe asked quietly. "Now I think someone believes it was real," Fritz said, "that something was hidden, and they believe I might still know it." Wolfe was silent. Fritz, encouraged perhaps by the lack of rebuke, added, "The letter, the one Fritz received, feels like it was meant for more than Gustav, for all of us." Wolfe's voice, when it came, was calm. "Why did you never mention this before?" "Because I thought I had left it behind," Fritz replied. For a man as verbally gifted as Nero Wolfe, his silences are rarely empty. They are precise, sculpted spaces into which the rest of us project our thoughts, and then wish we hadn't. After Fritz departed, Wolfe sat without speaking for a long stretch. I refrained from the usual commentary. He wasn't just digesting information, he was arranging it like a mental mise-en place. Finally, he spoke. "It is inconvenient," he said, "to learn that my chef has a more interesting past than I'd credited." I raised a brow. "You once told me you hired Fritz because he didn't ask questions." "He doesn't," Wolfe said. "But now I must." He reached for the letter again, tapping the edge of it with a finger. The phrasing, "seasoned betrayal," "ground into your meat," those were not intended merely to frighten, they were mnemonic. That language is calculated. Whoever sent this wanted it understood by specific men with shared knowledge. I leaned against the edge of the desk. "And you think Fritz is one of them?" "I think someone thinks so, which is for the moment sufficient." "What about Gustav?" "If he survived the initial attempt," Wolfe said, "he may yet speak. But we cannot wait for the spoken word when the written one has already moved." I nodded. "Then I'll find Jasper." "Yes," Wolfe said simply. "You will." And with that, the silence resumed, but this time it had a name to chase. Finding Jasper Mun wasn't as easy as running down to the corner and peering behind a stack of briskets. According to Elsa, he hadn't returned to work, hadn't answered calls, and had no next of kin listed in Kesler's employment files. So I did what I do when there's nothing obvious to start with. I got on the phone. I called a man I knew at the cab company Jasper used to take home. I called a guy at the utility board who owed me a favor from a parking ticket I'd made disappear. I called Saul Panzer, who didn't owe me anything but was decent enough to give me a tip anyway. By late afternoon, I was in Brooklyn, outside a row house that had seen better centuries. The landlord, a wiry man with a bad wig and the disposition of a lit match, confirmed that Jasper Mun had paid 2 weeks in advance and vacated without notice. I let myself into the tiny, second-floor apartment with the spare key and found it almost clinically clean. No dishes in the sink, no clothes in the drawers. But on the kitchen table was an envelope addressed to J.M. in tight square handwriting that matched Gustav Kesler's ledger entries. The envelope was empty, but the act of labeling it so neatly and leaving it behind reeked of message, not accident. Mun had left in a hurry, but not without trying to say something. I scanned the room again. One scrap of paper was stuck behind the radiator, a torn corner of what looked like a ledger page with one phrase scribbled across it. In the marrow lies memory. Not your average grocery list. I folded it carefully and headed out. Wolfe would know what marrow had to do with memory, and if he didn't, he'd certainly pretend he had all along. I found Jasper Mun in a third-rate boarding house in Bed-Stuy, 2 blocks from a butcher shop that hadn't changed its window display since the Nixon administration. He opened the door with the nervous energy of a man who knew someone might be coming but hadn't decided whether to be relieved or terrified. It was me. "You shouldn't have found me," he said, already stepping back to let me in. "That," I told him, brushing past, "is a sentiment shared by dozens, but I've got a knack." The room was a shade above dismal. A half-finished sandwich sat on the radiator, and a pair of socks were drying over the window latch. Jasper looked like he hadn't slept in 3 days. His hands were shaking as he poured himself a glass of water. I didn't need to ask if he had something to say. He wanted to talk. He just didn't know where to start. "He told me things," Jasper said suddenly. "Mr. Kesler. Not directly. Not all at once, but in pieces. After hours, when he thought no one was listening." "What sort of things?" "About the war, about smuggling, hidden codes, routes." He said they used recipes, measurements and instructions encoded routes across borders, Europe to the Americas. "And you believed him?" "I didn't want to, but he showed me a page once. It looked like a sausage recipe. Basic, until he explained it. The spices represented locations, ratios were distances, cooking times were ciphers. He laughed when I told him it was absurd, said the best secrets were the ones you fed to people." "And now?" "Now someone wants that recipe," Jasper said, "or wants it buried." He rubbed his face with a trembling hand. The morning he collapsed, a man came into the shop. Tall, quiet European accent. They argued in the back. Afterward, Kesler looked pale, panicked. That was the last I saw him. "Did you recognize the man?" "No, but he looked at me when he left. Just once. Like he knew I'd overheard." I studied him carefully. "And you ran?" "Yes," he said, with more shame than I expected. "And I'm still running." It was nearly 10 when I returned to the brownstone and found Saul Panzer in the front room, seated with his customary economy of motion and an expression that suggested he'd already finished what Wolfe would only now ask him to begin. Wolfe, ensconced in his chair with the morning's Gazette folded on his lap, gestured lazily toward the desk. "Mr. Panzer has been apprised of the essentials," he said. "You will brief him on Mun." I did, sparing no detail except the brand of coffee served at Jasper's hideout. Saul listened with the focus of a man whose hobbies included remembering things no one else had noticed. When I'd finished, Wolfe spoke. "There is a missing ledger, presumed destroyed or hidden. It may have contained ciphered entries. Mr. Mun believes it was connected to a smuggling network embedded in culinary instructions." Saul nodded. "That matches what I've seen. Old OSS files mention similar methods, mostly in occupied France. Recipes that served as encoded transport routes." Wolfe handed him the anonymous letter. "You'll find the origin of that typewriting. I want the make, model, and if possible, a list of known users within the last 20 years. "Understood." "And the man who visited Kesler? Tall, European, quiet." "I'll start with pan-Eurasian importers, then branch into old Interpol lists." "Do so," Wolfe said, closing his eyes. "Subtly." Saul rose without ceremony. "You'll have something in 48 hours?" I watched him go, feeling that peculiar blend of awe and envy I always did around Saul. He could vanish into the city like a whisper and return with answers nobody wanted heard. Wolfe sipped his beer. "Archie," he said, "there is something profoundly distasteful about intrigue conducted through sausage." "I don't disagree," I replied, but it does make for flavorful mystery. It was mid-morning the next day when Saul returned, as punctual as a pendulum and just as precise. Wolfe had foregone his usual orchid hour to remain in the office, which told me two things. One, this case had fully pierced the man's aversion to unnecessary motion, and two, he was no longer regarding the threat to Fritz as theoretical. Saul didn't waste time. He laid a slim manila folder on Wolfe's desk, then spoke with that crisp economy that always made me feel like I was paid by the syllable. The typewriter that produced the anonymous note was a 1946 Continental German make. Ribbon wear and margin irregularities suggest it matches two known machines registered post-war in the US. One was used by a German émigré in Milwaukee who died in 1989. The other, he paused, was in Gustav Kesler's possession until 5 years ago. He donated it to the German-American Cultural Society for display. Wolfe made a low grunt. So he had access. Saul nodded. Yes. Also, I located a scanned copy of Kesler's personal notebook from the mid-1950s. It was donated in partial facsimile to a culinary archive by Elsa last year. They digitized it. He handed Wolfe a printed excerpt. I leaned over to glance. The entry appeared to be a standard sausage recipe, until Wolfe pointed at the last line. Note the phrasing, do not overstuff the link lest the root collapse. That is not culinary advice, it's engineering metaphor. Code Wolfe looked up at Saul. Do you believe he preserved the system? Saul shrugged. Hard to say, but it was refined, not invented by amateurs. And Fritz? I asked. Saul hesitated. He may have been given a training manual disguised as a recipe book, a war-era tool passed off as a learning exercise. If so, it's possible he holds the cipher key and doesn't know it. Wolfe said nothing for a long moment. Then he reached for the page, studied it again, and made a small, tight sound in his throat, something like irritation, blended with unease. Archie, he said quietly, have Fritz bring me his old cookbook. The one from Würzburg. And just like that, the game shifted. Wolfe wasn't simply solving a mystery anymore, he was defending his household. When I told Fritz that Wolfe wanted his old cookbook, the one from Würzburg, his hands stiffened around the towel he was using to dry a copper pot. He didn't answer right away, which told me how deep this was rooted. Finally, he gave a small nod and disappeared into the pantry. He returned moments later with a thin, battered volume bound in cracked brown leather. The spine was nearly detached, and the edges were marked with years of grease and ink. He offered it to me as if it were fragile and sacred all at once. Wolfe took the book without comment, opened it, and began reading. Not skimming, reading. The silence stretched for nearly 15 minutes as I watched him work, eyes narrow, fingers turning each page with care. I saw no dramatic reactions, just an occasional stillness that suggested he'd found something important and was storing it in that private archive behind his brow. At last, he set the book down, gently, as though it might bruise. Then he reached for the bell pull and summoned Fritz. When Fritz entered, Wolfe didn't speak. He simply handed him the book and nodded. The meaning passed between them without a single word. When Fritz left, Wolfe leaned back and closed his eyes. I've seen him show respect but rarely warmth, and never, never without purpose. He spoke without looking at me. I will not permit this man to be harmed. I raised an eyebrow. Which man? He opened his eyes. The one who has never asked for help, but has always deserved it. I didn't say anything. You don't when Wolfe says something like that. You just make a note of it, for the record, and for the moment when it will matter. And I had the feeling that moment was coming. Gustav Kesler, formerly of Würzburg, latterly of Manhattan, and currently of Roosevelt Hospital's private ward, had the pallor of someone who'd seen both war and worse. When I arrived, Elsa was at his side, straight-backed and tight-lipped. The nurse allowed me a brief window, and Elsa stepped out after a glance at her father. He opened his eyes, slowly, and the first words out of his mouth, barely a whisper, were not what I'd expected. "The marrow, Archie," he said. "It's in the marrow, but the flavor still lingers." "Mr. Kesler," I said gently, "do you know who poisoned you?" His head shifted an inch on the pillow. I was warned, too late. The ledger was never safe. She thinks she's helping, but it's revenge or not repair. "Who?" I pressed. But his eyes had already closed again, the effort spent. The nurse returned and waved me off like a fly. I exited without argument, pausing in the hallway with 1,000 questions and no one present who could answer them honestly. Elsa was waiting near the elevator, arms folded. "Did he speak?" "Yes," I replied, watching her face closely. "Some kind of metaphor. Said something about marrow and flavor. Does that mean anything to you?" She shook her head with just a beat too much precision. "No," she said. "He was always cryptic, even with me." Back at the brownstone, I relayed the message to Wolfe in full. He didn't scoff or dismiss it. He merely nodded once, then uttered a single directive. "Get me Fritz's Würzburg notebook, the small one, the one with the oil-smudged corners." I went to the kitchen at once, and by the time I returned, Wolfe was already clearing space on his desk like a man about to unearth something long buried. The cookbook in question was no more than 40 pages, bound in worn linen and dense, with annotations in Fritz's careful script. I placed it on Wolfe's desk with the reverence one reserves for holy relics or family recipes. Wolfe barely glanced at me. His eyes were fixed on the spine, as if reading its contents by osmosis. He opened it midway, then began flipping slowly, almost reverently, his finger trailing the margin notes. Fritz had once told me that this volume was given to him by an old chef in Würzburg, to learn what cannot be taught in school. At the time I'd taken it for poetic nonsense. Now, watching Wolfe examine it like a Talmudic scholar cross-referencing hidden meanings, I reconsidered. "Here," Wolfe murmured, tapping a passage. I leaned in. The recipe was titled Würzfleisch mit geheimen Zügen, literally, spiced meat with secret motions. The ingredients were conventional, but the instructions were peculiar. Notations like rotate counterclockwise before chilling and divide into 7:12 ratio made no culinary sense. Wolfe didn't look up. "These aren't instructions," he said. "They're instructions disguised as instructions. Classic wartime cipher technique, hide the code in the expected." He turned to the back cover and peeled back the inside flap. There, penciled in faint German script, was a line that made my scalp prickle. "Der Schlüssel liegt im Verhältnis, nicht im Gewicht." The key lies in proportion, not in weight. Fritz had never mentioned this. Wolfe sat back, the cookbook still open. This is what they were protecting, or hiding, a system of transmission, perhaps for moving people, not goods. That would explain the caution. "And the poison?" I asked. Wolfe's lips twitched in a mirthless smile. "Poison is the last argument of those who failed at persuasion." The smile faded. "Bring me the Kesler ledger copy again," he said. "We need to see what else has been simmering." Wolfe read silently for nearly 20 minutes. I've seen him solve murders in less time, but this wasn't merely about death. It was about translation, history, and the uneasy fusion of both. The Kesler ledger, a meticulous list of supply deliveries and recipes going back 3 decades, looked innocuous at first glance, but under Wolfe's scrutiny it was as revealing as a confessional. He matched entries from the cookbook with specific items in the ledger, murmuring now and then when something clicked into place. "Note this," he said, pointing to an entry dated 1986. "Shipment of venison to a now-defunct Austrian grocer. Look at the notation beside it. Black Winter, 7:12. That's the same ratio from Fritz's margin notes." "You think it was a signal?" "Of course. A transmission of movement. Black Winter could be a person, or a location. The numbers are distances or schedules, and this isn't isolated. It repeats." He turned a few pages and jabbed a finger at another line. 3 smoked hams delivered to Heinrich M. See diagonal entry, 4-3. "That," he said, "is not logistics, it's a map." "To what?" to whatever Gustav thought needed hiding, likely people. Smugglers, defectors, maybe even art. The war didn't end cleanly for everyone. I watched him close the ledger with deliberate finality. So someone wanted this recipe buried, I said. Literally? Yes, Wolfe replied. And someone else believes Fritz knows the ingredients. He didn't say more, he didn't have to. The lines were drawn, the meat was on the fire. And Nero Wolfe, reluctant as ever, was finally preparing to serve something more than truth. Wolfe rarely explained himself aloud while working. He considered the act both unnecessary and vulgar. But occasionally, when the pieces fit together with elegant precision, he allowed a commentary to slip through like steam from a kettle just before it whistles. "This," he said now, running a thick finger along a column in Kesler's ledger, "is a map." I leaned over and he let me. The entry looked benign, deliveries of specialty sausage to various delis and importers over a span of weeks, but Wolfe had overlaid the coordinates from the coded recipe in Fritz's Würzburg notebook, and they lined up with a pattern. "East to west," he murmured. "Border to border, each item sent to a recipient with a silent history. Vienna, Geneva, Lyon, each shipment paired with a phrase, salted heritage, preserved ink, hollow rind, euphemisms for contents other than meat." "Artworks?" I asked. "Gold? People?" Wolfe didn't answer immediately. Then, without looking up, he said all three. Likely rotated, but primarily people. Refugees, escaped scientists, political undesirables, some important enough to warrant exquisite secrecy. He sat back, eyes narrowing. Kesler and others, Fritz among them, unwittingly or not, used their trade to route movement. Post-war underground rail, camouflaged in charcuterie. Highly effective. "And now someone's hunting the ledger," I said. "The records, the names, yes, but not merely to reclaim a legacy," Wolfe replied. "To erase it." The implication sat between us like the smell of smoked ham, inescapable and dense. I reached for the ledger, flipping toward the last known entries. And who would have reason to do that now? Who wants the roots buried? "That," Wolfe said slowly, "is the next layer. And I suspect we already know the name, only not as it was." And sure enough, the next entry he pointed to was one I'd seen before. An order placed by CD importers, Bronx. 6 hams, no invoice. The initials weren't just familiar, they were damning. "Carlo Demaglio," Wolfe said, enunciating the syllables as if they tasted unpleasant. Too gregarious, too forthcoming, and entirely too curious about Jasper Mun. I had to admit the signs had been there, though Demaglio had packaged himself as harmless with the finesse of a man used to obscuring facts under layers of charm and balsamic glaze. Wolfe retrieved an older document from his drawer, one Saul had provided weeks earlier, when a different case had brushed against European import circles. He unfolded it carefully and laid it beside the ledger. Note the name, Dieter Malko, former clerk of ration logistics in Hamburg, vanished in 1946, wanted by French authorities for complicity in unauthorized movements across occupied zones. I leaned closer. The archival photo, grainy but distinct, showed a man 30 years younger, but unmistakably Demaglio. The cheekbones were leaner, the eyes harder, but the smirk hadn't changed. "You think Kesler knew?" "I think Kesler always knew," Wolfe replied. But he was silent, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps convenience, or perhaps he believed foolishly that the past had cooled. And now Demaglio wants the ledger. To destroy it, to bury the map, to sever the link to his former identity and any surviving knowledge of it. He believed Kesler was weakening, and he was right. But Fritz is a complication. And Jasper? A liability. He was silenced by fear, but if Demaglio thought him dangerous enough to intimidate, he's close to acting. I stood, heading for the hallway. "Where are you going?" Wolfe asked. "To prepare the table," I said. "You're getting ready to serve the truth, and I have a feeling it's going to be a full-course reveal." I didn't have to chase Elsa far. She returned to the shop just after I arrived, locking the door behind her with the exact composure of a woman who thought she still controlled the narrative. She didn't ask why I was there. That in itself was telling. "I saw my father," I said, watching her face. He spoke, briefly. Her hands froze on the drawer she'd just opened. "What did he say?" "That the ledger wasn't safe, that you believed you were helping." She exhaled slowly. He would say that. "I've got a theory," I said, stepping forward. "You knew about the smuggling. Maybe not the full extent, but enough. Enough to know that ledger mattered." "I never saw it," she said. "He never let me near it, but I knew it existed, I suspected. Over the years, small things, changes in deliveries, names that didn't match paperwork. He tried to keep it from me." "And you thought he was being used?" "No," she said. "I thought he was wasting his legacy, letting it vanish in the name of secrecy. He was proud of what he did, but he buried it. I didn't want revenge, Mr. Goodwin. I wanted him remembered. But there were others, Carlo especially. He came asking questions. He wanted the book. He said he could protect it. I didn't trust him." "So you tampered with the sausage?" Her silence was answer enough. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," she said at last. I thought if it forced him to come forward, to talk, to share. But then he collapsed, and I panicked. Why not tell Wolfe?" She laughed quietly. "Would you? He's terrifying. He's also the only person alive who might be able to keep this from ending badly." She met my gaze squarely. "It already has." I left her there, guilt sharpening her edges. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was waiting, not surprised. "She acted out of filial desperation," he said. "That may mitigate her motives, but not her methods." "What now?" He pressed his fingertips together. "Now," he said, "we cook." The invitations were handwritten on Wolfe's thick cream stationery, unsigned but unmistakable. They were delivered by me personally because Wolfe said, "The scent of resolution should arrive with your cologne, not a courier." Each invite contained only the time and address, 6:45 sharp, Wolfe's brownstone, dinner served at 7. No explanation, no RSVP. It was the kind of summons that hinted at both opportunity and judgment. In other words, Wolfe was baiting a trap, and he wanted the guests to know it. Elsa accepted in clipped tones, claiming she had nothing to hide. Jasper Mun took more convincing. He arrived at the door looking like a man who had finally decided he'd rather face death in a room with linen napkins than die alone in a bedsit with peeling wallpaper. Carlo Demaglio, to no one's surprise, responded with the most enthusiasm. "Ah, dinner with the great man himself," he'd exclaimed, patting my shoulder like a butcher greeting a lamb. "It will be, delicious." I didn't bother to respond. Fritz, for his part, took to the kitchen with grim focus. Wolfe had specified that the menu reflect the original order Kesler had delivered before this entire charade began, same cuts, same seasoning. Only this time, Wolfe had supervised the preparation himself. "This is not merely a meal," he had said, "but a reconstruction." The invitation was more than symbolic, it was psychological leverage. Wolfe believed that no man, regardless of guilt or innocence, could sit down to a recreated crime without revealing something of himself. And when the menu itself was evidence, each bite was a deposition. By 6:30, the table was set. Crystal gleamed, porcelain glowed, and Fritz hovered like a man steeling himself to serve more than food. Wolfe entered the dining room precisely at 6:44, nodded once, and sat at the head of the table. "Archie," he murmured, "let them in." And so I did. They filed in like players, summoned to a final act, each one dressed, groomed, and guarded. Demaglio led the procession, smiling like a showman greeting a board of potential investors. He bowed slightly toward Wolfe, who offered no return. Jasper Mun came next, pallid and perspiring, his eyes flicking from seat to seat as if expecting them to vanish. Elsa arrived last, her mouth set in a line that spoke more of resignation than resistance. Fritz, dressed in his dinner whites, moved silently between the settings, placing silverware with the reverence of a high priest preparing an altar. Wolfe had chosen his favourite burgundy to accompany the meal, and I poured with care, noting which hands trembled, which eyes watched me too closely, and which deliberately didn't watch at all. The opening course was served, a pâté that mirrored Gustav's signature style. Wolfe lifted his fork with ceremony and tasted, then set it down and looked around the table. The silence was dense. "You have all wondered," he began, "why you are here. Curiosity and dread, both reasonable reactions. I shall relieve neither immediately. Instead, you will eat. What you are eating is a replica, a reenactment." Demaglio chuckled, a short, rehearsed sound. "This is quite the performance, Mr. Wolfe." Wolfe turned his gaze toward him. "No, Mr. Demaglio, this is cuisine. The performance begins now." The main course followed. Sausages, artfully coiled and garnished, indistinguishable from the batch that had arrived the morning Kesler collapsed. Each plate had been prepared with precision, each seasoning weighed and measured under Wolfe's eye. "I trust the flavor is familiar?" Wolfe asked, watching Demaglio with surgical interest. The older man paused. "Exquisite, though I confess I'm more intrigued by your choice of symbolism." Wolfe sipped his wine. "It is not symbolism, Mr. Demaglio, it is evidence. Tonight, the table is the archive, the plate, the document. And you—" he paused, then looked at each guest in turn. "You are the annotation." The table fell quiet again. Then Wolfe added, "You may continue eating. You will want your strength." The meal had only just begun, but the interrogation had already started, and Wolfe hadn't yet raised his voice. By the time the second course was cleared, wild mushroom tartlets with black truffle cream, no garnish, Wolfe had finished half a glass of burgundy and remained silent, which, as anyone who's sat through one of his more theatrical dinners knows, was often a more effective tactic than speech. But eventually he stirred, adjusted the crease in his vest, and addressed the table in a voice low, measured, and, as always, unignorable. "It is curious," he began, "how taste, our most intimate and immediate sense, is also the most deceptive." He glanced down at the table, then back up, his eyes moving from face to face. "Salt can suggest sweetness. Bitterness can imply depth. Spice may obscure rot. And yet we trust the tongue more than the eye, the nose, even the mind. We swallow symbols and call it sustenance." Demaglio smirked, but said nothing. Jasper blinked rapidly, while Elsa's mouth set into a line so thin it might have disappeared. Wolfe continued, "There are, of course, recipes that nourish, recipes that comfort, and there are recipes with darker histories, encoded instructions, proportions that mean more than flavor. One may feed the body and signal a betrayal." He paused, letting the weight of that hang like the aroma of garlic in a cold room. "Tonight's meal is not merely replication, it is resuscitation. The food you have eaten was originally intended for this house, delivered by a man who collapsed under pressure, pressure not from heat, but from history, from knowledge unspoken and debts unpaid." He sipped the wine, then set his glass down. "The ledger, the sausage, the seasoning ratios, they were not abstractions, they were transportation, maps, a path smuggled under salami, and now someone wants the path erased." He looked directly at Demaglio, "because they walked it," and then at Elsa, "because they preserved it," and finally at Jasper, "because they read it." The silence that followed wasn't shock, it was tension, strung tight across three nervous minds and one very calm one. Wolfe folded his hands atop his napkin. "I detest melodrama, but I detest willful ignorance more. Tonight the table is not merely set for dining, but for revelation." The knives had not moved, but the cutting had begun. Wolfe turned his attention to Elsa with the same deliberate grace he might use to admire a rare orchid, calm, exact, and not entirely kind. "Miss Kesler," he said, "you claimed you did not know the nature of your father's work beyond his meats and recipes. Yet you delivered a package that nearly cost Fritz Brenner his nerve, and Gustav Kesler his life. And I do not believe in culinary coincidence. Elsa met his gaze. I packed what was ordered, nothing more. Indeed, Wolfe said, but with what motive? You were aware of the ledger, you suspected what it contained, though your father never confirmed it. And when Demaglio came sniffing for more than fennel and fat, you realized your father's legacy was in danger of being buried, not by time, but by design. Demaglio interjected smoothly. Come now, Wolfe, surely we're not painting the girl as a conspirator. She's a daughter, concerned, emotional. It's not a crime to protect one's father. Wolfe ignored him entirely. You tampered with the sausage, Wolfe stated. Not to kill, to compel, to force your father's hand. You believed if he thought someone was targeting him, he would unearth the truth, reveal the book, the code, the legacy. Elsa's hands were folded in her lap, but one thumb rubbed the other like a metronome. He never intended to speak of it, Wolfe continued, even when he saw the trap. He thought silence would save everyone, but silence has poor judgment, and so you intervened. She inhaled slowly. Yes. Just that, nothing more, not defiant, not ashamed, just true. Wolfe nodded once. You gambled on urgency, but the result was poison in the wrong gut. You saw your father's health fail and feared you'd accelerated the erasure instead of preventing it. She nodded. Yes. Wolfe turned his head just slightly. It was not murder, but it was folly. She looked down. Tonight, he said, you will not be judged. That is for others. But you will not be silent. Elsa said nothing more, but her thumb stopped moving. And for Wolfe, that was answer enough. The room hung quiet, still expectant. The next course and the next confrontation were both yet to come. Wolfe allowed a breath of silence after Elsa's admission, long enough for it to settle in, not long enough to harden. Then he shifted slightly in his chair and fixed his gaze on the man seated 2 places down. Demaglio, ever the performer, dabbed delicately at the corners of his mouth with his napkin and raised one brow with mild amusement, as if the entire proceeding were a charity auction he'd graciously agreed to attend. Mr. Demaglio, Wolfe said, his voice smooth as warm brandy, your appetite is admirable. Demaglio chuckled. An old habit, I'm afraid. In my line of work, one must never offend the chef. Indeed, Wolfe replied, although I question whether your habit is as old as you claim. Pardon? Wolfe leaned forward ever so slightly, hands steepled. You have passed yourself off as a gourmand, a connoisseur of imports, a patron of heritage cuisine, and yet the records I hold, courtesy of Mr. Panzer, place you in the Rhineland in 1945, not as a supplier, but as a facilitator. Demaglio's smile faltered, just a fraction. I've seen more movement in granite, but Wolfe noticed. I'm afraid I don't follow, Demaglio said, smoothing his napkin again. You do, Wolfe said flatly. The Continental typewriter, the ledger entries, your visit to Kesler, uninvited, unrecorded, and ill-timed. You've spent 3 decades curating a new persona, shuffling your past under layers of smoke and fennel. But Gustav knew. He knew you as Dieter Malkow. You were not simply a trader of goods, Mr. Demaglio. You were a saboteur of supply lines, a man who repurposed humanitarian logistics for personal gain. That's preposterous, Demaglio said. You have no proof of that. On the contrary, Wolfe said, lifting a sheet of thin paper from the folder beside him. This is a shipping manifest from 1946. Several names match entries in Kesler's ledger, including Heinrich M., a known alias of your former associate. The recipe you called nonsense was in fact the code. You underestimated its elegance because you no longer understood it. Demaglio's fingers clenched just slightly around his wine glass. I've done nothing wrong. You've done nothing traceable, Wolfe corrected. Until now. He turned toward me. Archie, I rose. Mr. Panzer is stationed just outside. Kindly alert him to remain near the rear entrance. Demaglio's jaw tightened. He said nothing. It was, I must admit, the first honest thing he'd done all evening. Wolfe did not rise, and he did not raise his voice. He merely unfolded the final page of the Würzburg notebook, the same page Fritz had once used to scrawl a note about spice balances and grill temperature. Wolfe held it delicately like a papyrus scroll and turned it toward the room. "This," he said, "is the original. The last recipe." He placed it gently on the table. Fritz, from his silent post behind the sideboard, inhaled softly, but said nothing. Demaglio did not look at the page. His gaze was fixed straight ahead, immobile, like a man watching the sun rise behind a firing squad. "The measurements correspond to precise mile markers," Wolfe said, tapping the recipe with a stubby forefinger. "The blend of meats represents coded identifications, categories of cargo, or in this case, human lives. The chilling time, oven setting, and salting ratio serve as dates, distances, and cautionary flags. It is, in short, a map and a history." He turned his eyes to Elsa. "Your father did not merely feed people, he ferried them across borders under false names, buried in manifest sheets, camouflaged in kielbasa." Elsa's face was pale, but calm. I knew there was something noble in what he hid. "You were right," Wolfe said. "But nobility does not erase risk. The preservation of truth often endangers those nearest it." Then, without flourish, Wolfe turned once more to Demaglio. "Your concern was not the ledger itself, but what it implied. It confirmed you were once part of a network you later betrayed. A network that has now been unburied by a chef, a book, and a man with a taste for justice." Demaglio did not speak. "The ledger, the typewriter, the ledger copy," Elsa gave, "to the archive, the Würzburg cookbook, all will be handed over. I have prepared copies and a statement. The press will receive it in the morning." Demaglio stood then, stiffly. "You'll regret this." Wolfe's voice did not change. "Possibly, but I'll digest it well." A moment later, Saul entered from the back door and nodded to me. "Escort him?" I said. As Saul followed Demaglio out, Elsa exhaled for the first time in what must have been 20 minutes. Wolfe reached for his glass. "Fritz," he said, "please bring the final course." And then, calmly, as though we hadn't just served justice with mustard and wine, we sat down again. The sausage, at last, was safe. When the final course had been cleared, Fritz's apricot tart with whipped creme fraiche and almond dust, which no one touched. Wolfe dabbed the corners of his mouth and leaned back in his chair with the air of a man who had done precisely what he set out to do, and in the exact time he had allotted for it. Demaglio, to his credit, waited until then. He stood not hurriedly, not rudely, but with the precision of someone calculating which movement might cause the least notice and the greatest distance. He murmured something that may have been "my compliments," or possibly "my apologies," though neither was sincere. Wolfe did not rise. He did not even blink. I was already on my feet, but I didn't have to move. Saul Panzer stepped in through the back entrance, his timing as impeccable as his trench coat. He had positioned himself in the service hallway adjoining the kitchen, and his entry was silent but not soft. Demaglio froze mid-step, not in theatrical shock, but with the resigned sag of a man who had bet against inevitability and lost. Saul didn't touch him. He didn't need to. He just said, "This way, Mr. Malchow," using the name that no longer existed, and that alone turned Demaglio's face to granite. As Saul escorted him out, Wolfe turned toward me. "Call Inspector Stebbins," he said. "Tell him there is a man en route to the precinct who will require handling with both discretion and authority. He is in possession of a past the state may find inconvenient and a ledger that proves inconvenient truths." I nodded. "And the charges?" "Forgery, fraud, possibly conspiracy," Wolfe replied. "But let Stebbins stew the details. I have no appetite for courtroom dramatics." "And the press?" Wolfe raised an eyebrow. "The press," he said, "can starve a little longer." Behind him, Fritz emerged quietly from the kitchen, a single plate in his hands. "Final course, sir?" "No," Wolfe said, "not tonight." He looked around the empty dining room, now stripped of its players and tension. "There are some meals," he said, "best left unfinished." And for once, no one, not even me, argued. The brownstone has a rhythm, ornate, deliberate, and utterly immovable. When that rhythm falters, you feel it. The floors creak differently, the air moves wrong, even the orchids sulk. For days after Demaglio's exit, things remained slightly out of step. Wolfe read less. I talked less. Even Fritz's knives lost some of their usual percussion against the cutting board, but eventually, as always, the world began to right itself, starting where it always must, in the kitchen. It was early on a Thursday when I stepped in for a glass of water and found Fritz hunched over the marble counter, surrounded by a perimeter of clipped herb stems and parchment scraps. He didn't look up as I entered, and I didn't speak. The only sounds were the soft hiss of oil in the pan and the whisper of a wooden spoon against stainless steel. Whatever he was making smelled good. Better than good, in fact. Familiar, but different. The aroma had the rich warmth of cured pork, but it was subtler, more layered. There were hints of rosemary, a shade of lemon rind, and something gently smoky I couldn't place. After a moment, he glanced at me and said, without inflection, "It's a new blend." "Does it have a name?" His mouth quirked, barely. "Not yet. You could call it Redemption Sausage or Legacy Link." He shook his head. Too loud. He turned back to the pan and after a few beats said quietly, "He knew. About the ledger, about everything. He just never wanted to burden anyone with it. Not even me." "I'd say he succeeded," I replied, "until someone else decided it was worth digging up." Fritz nodded once, then picked up a small plate and began arranging slices of the finished sausage with a precision that bordered on reverence. "I'm calling it forgiveness sausage," he said at last, placing the plate on a silver tray. "For those who knew and said nothing, and for those who did not know and said less." I didn't comment. Some recipes don't need seasoning. He lifted the tray and disappeared toward the dining room. I followed a moment later, letting the scent of quiet absolution lead the way. Wolfe was in his chair, of course. Where else would he be? Flanked by the Gazette and a half-read botanical quarterly, both arranged just so. He did not look up when Fritz entered with the tray, nor when the plate was placed before him with quiet ceremony. Fritz said nothing. That too was part of the rhythm. I stood off to the side, watching. Wolfe reached for his fork, not urgently, but without hesitation. He speared a slice, studied it with the same scrutiny he might give a misaligned orchid stamen, and brought it to his mouth, a chew, a pause, another. Then he set the fork down and reached for his beer. No words, no declaration, no raised brows or satisfied hums, just a quiet sip of beer and the gentle shift of his bulk settling more comfortably into the chair. Fritz, for his part, offered no victory lap. He simply nodded, turned, and exited the room with the silent dignity of a man who had fed an empire and been thanked with silence. Wolfe swallowed, exhaled, and spoke without looking at me. "I do not care for sentimental gestures." "I know," I said. "But there is a place," he continued, "for personal acknowledgements rendered through honest craft." "Also known as sausage," I supplied. He did not respond. He didn't need to. The ledger was gone, turned over to Stebbins along with a statement Wolfe had dictated but refused to sign. Demaglio would vanish into whatever quiet federal drawer they used for men who'd once mattered in the wrong ways. And Elsa had returned to the shop, this time not to hide a legacy, but to carry it. Fritz returned to the kitchen. Saul returned to wherever Saul returns to. Wolfe remained where he always remains. And I? I poured myself a second glass of beer, leaned against the desk and said, "You know, I'll never look at a sausage the same way again." Wolfe finally looked at me. His expression was dry as toast. There are worse lessons. We sat there a moment, the afternoon creeping along its usual lines, the house no longer bent under secrets. The rhythm had returned, and for now it was enough. If there's a lesson to be learned in the whole sordid affair, and I say sordid, knowing full well it was dressed in linen napkins and served with burgundy, it's this: trust no food that arrives with history baked in. Wolfe, of course, returned to form within days. The orchids regained their schedule, the beer returned to its preferred temperature, and Fritz's hands lost that tremor that had haunted them since Kesler collapsed. But me, I haven't looked at a sausage the same way since. They say sausage, like law and politics, should never be watched in the making. I'd now add espionage and post-war smuggling networks to the list. There's something about knowing that a smoked link once mapped a human escape route that makes your next hot dog feel a little philosophical. Wolfe never commented on Fritz's new recipe again, but I caught him ordering it twice in the following week, which is as close as Wolfe gets to sentiment. Fritz, for his part, didn't name it on the house menu. It went in the book as number 47A, Reserve Blend. We all knew what it meant. No one asked twice. Elsa sent a quiet thank you note. No signature, just a pressed sprig of rosemary between the pages. Wolfe didn't acknowledge it, though he filed it in the top drawer, under K, and I didn't tease him about it more than once. As for me, I've resumed my regular bacon regimen, though I've taken to asking Fritz where it's from. Casually, of course, just in case it happens to also be a map to a forgotten cache of stolen Rembrandts or a diplomatic back-channel to Prague, because when you've seen what sausage can really conceal, you learn to treat even breakfast with a certain caution. And if you don't believe me, just ask Fritz, though I wouldn't expect him to answer. It was a quiet Tuesday when the next thread unspooled. I was sorting mail as usual, circulars, catalogues, an overly optimistic offer from a phone company Wolfe had blacklisted in 1973, when I came across a thick ivory envelope, sealed in wax, and smelling faintly of cocoa. It was addressed to Nero Wolfe, in the looping cursive of someone who either owned a fountain pen or took their leisure time very seriously. I placed it beside Wolfe's untouched coffee and resumed reading a write-up on orchid sabotage in Le Jardin Précieux. Don't ask why. Some things are better left unknown. Wolfe entered 5 minutes later, glanced at the letter, and paused mid-stride. That alone was notable. Wolfe rarely paused for anything not edible, botanical, or broadcast. He peeled the wax seal with one finger and read in silence. Then, without so much as a sigh, he folded the letter, placed it beside his cup, and spoke. Archie? Yes, sir? Do you care for chocolate? Depends on the context. If it's dessert, yes. If it's motive, I'll need details. He handed me the letter. I scanned it quickly. A Belgian chocolatier, famed throughout Antwerp and evidently discreetly connected to several intelligence circles, was requesting Wolfe's assistance. There had been a disappearance, a recipe, a missing heir, and, yes, some questionable pralines. This sounds, I said, like the start of indigestion. Wolfe raised an eyebrow. It sounds, he said, like work. I nodded and reached for my notebook. You think the chocolates are poisoned? He shook his head. Worse. I think they're bait. I sighed, clicked my pen, and wrote the date at the top of the page. The sausage was behind us. The chocolate lay ahead, and I had a feeling we were about to find out just how bitter sweet could be.